Welcome back. If you were here for part 1, thank you for returning. We left the story in Mexico City in 1986, with Diego Maradona lifting the World Cup trophy, with Argentina celebrating the most complete individual tournament performance the sport has ever seen, with the hand of God and the goal of the century still echoing across the summer air. That was the end of one era. This is the beginning of another. Because the World Cup didn't stop in 1986. It kept going. It kept producing the extraordinary and the heartbreaking and the improbable and the beautiful. It kept finding new stages and new players and new moments that the sport had never seen before and hasn't seen since. From Italia, 90, all the way to Qatar, 2022. The second half of the greatest show on earth. Settle in. We're not finished yet. Chapter 7. Italia 90, USA 94, and the changing game. The World Cup arrived in Italy in the summer of 1990, carrying the momentum of everything that had come before it. The beauty of 1982, the genius of 1986, the accumulated mythology of 60 years of tournaments, and produced something unexpected, something that divided opinion at the time and has divided it ever since. A World Cup of extraordinary drama and almost willful ugliness. A tournament that generated more genuine, visceral, unforgettable emotional moments than almost any other, and produced them through football that was, for long stretches, the most defensively organized, the most physically attritional, the most deliberately committed to preventing, rather than creating, that the competition had ever seen. Italia 90, the tournament that gave the world Gazza's tears and Schillaci's goals, and the semi-finals that broke two nations' hearts simultaneously. That produced the lowest goals per game average in World Cup history. That was, depending on your perspective, either a masterpiece of competitive tension or a demonstration of football eating itself. Both perspectives contain truth. Neither contains the whole of it. Italy as a host brought everything. The football, the passion, the specific, operatic intensity of a nation that treated the sport not as entertainment but as identity, as the most direct expression of regional pride and national character available in a country that had spent much of its history arguing about both. The stadia were full. The atmosphere was extraordinary. The streets of Italian cities during the tournament carried the particular electricity of a country that understood it was the center of the world for 1 month. And on the pitch in the early matches, the football reflected the atmosphere, attacking, producing goals and chances and the specific expansive energy of teams playing in front of crowds that demanded entertainment. Then the knockout rounds arrived. The tournament's defining character, the defensive organization, the tactical caution, the willingness of teams to sacrifice attacking ambition for defensive solidity. Teams arrived in Italy understanding that the risk of conceding in a knockout tournament, where a single goal could end months of preparation, outweighed the reward of attacking with the abandon that the beautiful game demanded. And so they didn't attack with abandon. They organized. They compressed. They defended deep and narrow and made the central spaces so congested that creativity, the specific space-dependent creativity of the great playmakers and wide players, had nowhere to operate. The result was football that produced moments of genuine quality, surrounded by long stretches of caution, so extreme it bordered on paralysis. The goals per game average of 2.21 was the lowest in the tournament's history. 14 of the 52 matches were decided by penalty shootout or a single goal. But the drama was extraordinary. The tournament's first great story was not a country, it was a player. Salvatore Totò Schillaci, a Sicilian forward who had arrived at Juventus only the previous season after a career in the lower reaches of Italian football, who had been included in the Italian squad not as a guaranteed starter but as a squad option, a player who might contribute from the bench if the circumstances required it. The circumstances required it immediately. Against Austria in Italy's opening match, Schillaci came off the bench and scored. Italy won 1-0. He scored again in the next match, and the next, and the next. 6 goals in the tournament, the Golden Boot. The player who had arrived as a peripheral figure becoming in the space of a month the most celebrated footballer in Italy. His face, wide-eyed, intense, the expression of a man who cannot quite believe what is happening to him, became the image of the tournament. Not the elegant superstar performing as expected, the unexpected arrival. The player who had spent a career in the shadows suddenly, inexplicably illuminated. Italy were unbeaten going into the semi-finals, playing in front of their own supporters, with Schillaci in the form of his life. The country was beginning to believe. England. No account of Italia 90 is complete without England, who arrived in Italy with a squad that had been written off before the tournament started. Written off by their own press, by the football establishment, by the accumulated weight of 2 decades of underperformance at major tournaments, and who produced a run to the semi-finals that the country has not been able to stop talking about since. Not because they won, because of how they lost, and because of one moment. In a quarter-final against Cameroon, who had beaten Argentina in the group stage, who were the most exciting team in the tournament, who played with a directness and an attacking instability that made every match they were involved in feel genuinely unpredictable. England nearly went out. They won 3-2. After extra time, after being 2-1 down, after Roger Milla, the Cameroonian forward who was 38 years old and had come out of retirement to play in the tournament and who celebrated his goals with a hip-swiveling dance at the corner flag that became one of the tournament's iconic images, had scored twice. England survived into the semi-finals against West Germany at the Stadio delle Alpi in Turin. The semi-final between England and West Germany on the 4th of July 1990 is one of the most discussed matches in English football history. Not because England won, because England lost, and because of the way they lost. The match was level at 1-1 after extra time. It went to penalties. Stuart Pearce missed. Chris Waddle missed. West Germany won. England went home. And the image that the tournament produced, the image that Italia 90 is most immediately remembered by in England, was not a goal or a save or a moment of individual brilliance. It was a face. Paul Gascoigne. Gaza. 23 years old. The most naturally gifted English footballer of his generation. A player of extraordinary technical quality and footballing intelligence wrapped in a personality so chaotic and so endearing and so completely ungovernable that he was simultaneously the country's greatest football asset and its most complicated human story. In the semi-final, with the match still level and England still alive, Gascoigne received a yellow card, his second of the tournament, which meant that if England won, if the team he had carried and inspired and made his own got through this match to the final, he would miss it. The realization hit him immediately. The eyes filled, the lip trembled, and then the tears came. In full view of 59,000 people in the stadium and hundreds of millions watching on television across the world. Gaza crying, Gaza's tears. The image became immediately one of the most recognized in the history of the sport. Not because England won, not because Gascoigne produced a moment of individual brilliance, but because the cameras caught, in a single, unguarded expression, the specific, terrible vulnerability of a young man who had just understood that something he wanted enormously was being taken from him. It was not a sporting image. It was a human image. And it moved people who had never previously cared about football. Because grief, even the grief of a footballer about a yellow card, looks the same on every face. Argentina returned to defend their title. But without the Maradona of 1986, he was there. Still the captain. Still the most important player. Still capable, in individual moments, of producing things that reminded you what the 1986 version had been. But he was not that player. He was 30 years old, carrying the specific burden of being the one person on earth of whom an entire nation expected miracles, carrying injuries, carrying the complications of a life lived at a volume and an intensity that took its toll. Argentina were terrible. Genuinely, surprisingly, comprehensively terrible. They won one of their 3 group matches. They reached the final, against West Germany, a rematch of 1986, and the final of 1990 was, by general agreement, the worst in the tournament's history. Argentina had 2 players sent off. West Germany scored the only goal from a penalty in the 85th minute. Andreas Bremer, 1-0. West Germany were world champions. Argentina finished with 9 players. The tournament ended not with celebration, but with the specific, deflated disappointment of an occasion that had failed to provide what the occasion demanded. The football had not been worthy of the moment, but the tournament had produced something else, something that would matter more, in retrospect, than any result. The 1990 World Cup, for all its defensive caution and low goals and occasionally painful football, had reached new audiences. Television audiences, global audiences. The tournament in Italy was watched on a scale that previous World Cups hadn't approached. The combination of Italian passion, dramatic storylines, the emotional accessibility of Gazza's tears and Schillaci's goals, and Miller's dancing. These things crossed the language barriers and the football knowledge barriers that had previously limited the sport's global reach. People who had never watched a football match watched Italia 90 and kept watching. The World Cup in 1990 became something closer to what Jules Rimet had imagined in 1929, a genuinely global event, watched by everyone, not just by the football literate, by everyone. USA 1994. The most improbable location in the tournament's history. A country that didn't have a professional football league. The decision to award the 1994 World Cup to the United States was partly contingent on the creation of one, Major League Soccer, which launched in 1996, and that was regarded by the football world with a mixture of curiosity and mild condescension. Americans didn't understand football, didn't love it, didn't need it. The tournament would be a commercial exercise, a way of generating revenue and expanding the sport's reach into the world's largest economy, rather than a genuine football event. That was the assumption. The assumption was wrong. The Americans attended in extraordinary numbers. The stadiums, many of them NFL venues converted and expanded, were full. The atmosphere in the matches that mattered was as intense and as loud and as genuinely passionate as anything the tournament had previously experienced. And the football, for significant stretches, was excellent. Brazil returned to the World Cup in 1994 without the philosophical commitment of 1982. No Socrates, no Falcão, no Zico. A different Brazil, harder. more pragmatic, built around defensive solidity and the specific devastating quality of their attacking pair. Romario and Bebeto. Two different kinds of genius occupying the same forward line. Romario, compact, low to the ground, possessed of a penalty area instinct so refined it recalled the great poachers of previous generations. A player who scored goals from positions so tight, so apparently impossible, that defenders looking at replays still couldn't fully explain how it had happened. Bebeto, taller, more elegant, the creator as well as the finisher. The player who dropped deep and linked play and found Romario in the spaces that Romario spent his entire career positioning himself to occupy. Together they were the best striking partnership in the tournament, possibly in the history of the World Cup. They scored 7 goals between them, including the goal against the Netherlands in the quarter-final that Bebeto celebrated with the cradle, rocking an imaginary baby in his arms, celebrating the birth of his son Mateus 3 days earlier, with Romario and Mazinho joining him. The cradle celebration, one of the most imitated in the history of football, produced in a World Cup quarter-final, by a man who had just become a father. Brazil won. Of course they won. They beat the Netherlands in the semi-finals. They reached the final. Against Italy, the final between Brazil and Italy on the 17th of July 1994 in the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, California, was the first World Cup final to be decided by a penalty shootout. It was, for most of its 120 minutes, exactly the kind of football that the 1990 World Cup had been criticized for producing. Cautious, tight, defensively organized. Two teams so afraid of losing that they struggled to find the space to win, 0-0 after 90 minutes. 0-0 after extra time. Penalties. Brazil scored all 4 of theirs. Italy's first 3 takers scored. Franco Baresi, the libero, the captain, the most complete defensive player of his generation, already 34 years old and playing in what would be his last World Cup, stepped up and missed. Over the bar. Daniele Massaro's penalty was saved. Mazinho scored for Brazil. Alberigo Ivani scored for Italy. Brazil's 4th penalty, scored by Branco, meant that Italy needed their final taker to score to stay alive. Roberto Baggio, the divine ponytail, the Ballon d'Or winner, the most celebrated Italian footballer of his generation. A player who had carried Italy through the tournament, scoring 5 goals, producing performances of extraordinary individual quality that had made him the most discussed player in the competition alongside Romario. He stepped up, struck the ball. Too high, over the bar. Brazil won the World Cup. And the image of Roberto Baggio, head bowed, hands on his knees, the ponytail hanging, standing in the California sunshine in front of a goal that contained no goalkeeper and no ball, became one of the defining images in World Cup history. Not just in the tournament's history, in the history of sport. The expression on his face, the specific, particular, terrible expression of a man who has just done the thing he will spend the rest of his life being remembered for. Not for the 5 goals, not for the performances that got Italy to the final, for the penalty that went over the bar, because the World Cup is that, among all the other things it is. It is the tournament that defines players not just by their finest moments, but by their lowest. By the moment when everything was asked of them and everything was insufficient. By the penalty that cleared the bar. By the silence that followed. By the image that endures. But Brazil won. Romario lifted the trophy. Their 4th World Cup, equaling Germany's total, and the tournament in the United States had done what its supporters had promised it would do. It had reached new audiences. It had produced extraordinary moments. It had expanded the sport's global reach in ways that the football establishment had doubted were possible. And it had left behind an image, Baggio's image, that the world would never forget. The World Cup had changed, not just in terms of geography, though the decision to take the tournament to the United States had been genuinely radical. A recognition that football's growth required it to go where football wasn't yet, rather than returning, always, to where it already was. But in terms of what it had become. By 1994, the World Cup was not just the world's greatest football competition. It was the world's greatest sporting event. The numbers, the attendance figures, the television audiences, the commercial revenues, exceeded every other sporting occasion on the planet. The Olympic Games were larger in scope, but nothing produced the concentrated, sustained, month-long global attention of the World Cup. Nothing else made half the world stop and watch. The dream that Jules Rimet had carried from a village in eastern France had become, by 1994, the largest dream sport had ever had. And the next chapter of that dream was about to be written in France by a man with Algerian parents and two-headed goals in a final. And a story that would take 12 more years to reach its full, complicated, impossibly dramatic conclusion. Chapter 8. France 98 and Zidane's first coronation. France in the summer of 1998 felt like a country preparing for something it had always been promised. Not just a World Cup, not just the hosting of the largest sporting event on the planet. Though the organization was extraordinary, the stadia magnificent, the infrastructure of a tournament spread across 10 cities managed with a precision that made previous hosts look slightly improvised by comparison. Something more than that. A moment. A specific, collective, nationally significant moment in which a country that had spent decades producing extraordinary individual footballers without ever quite producing the team performance that their talent deserved, would, finally, in front of their own people, do what had always seemed possible, and never quite materialized. Win the World Cup. The French squad of 1998 was the most ethnically diverse in the tournament's history. Players from across the former French Empire, from Guadeloupe, from Senegal, from Algeria, from New Caledonia, playing alongside players from the metropolitan heartland of French football, in a team that reflected, more completely than any previous French national side, the country that France had actually become. It was called, by those who celebrated its composition, Black Blanc Beurre, Black, White, Arab, a slogan, a shorthand, a description of the coalition of backgrounds and cultures and football traditions that Aimé Jacquet had assembled into something that was more than the sum of its parts. A team, a genuine collective, mutually committed team, built around a spine of extraordinary quality, and at its center, not literally at its heart in terms of position, but in terms of everything the team's style and ambition and ultimate achievement depended on, Zinedine Zidane. Zidane's story has appeared elsewhere in this telling. In the chapter about the number 10, in the portrait of the last classic creative midfielder. But here, in the context of France 98 and what it produced, it requires its fullest treatment. Because France 98 was Zidane's tournament in a way that was different from the ways in which great players define tournaments. He didn't score goals across multiple matches. He didn't produce a sustained series of individual performances that made him the competition's most visible figure. He was suspended for the second group match and the round of 16, having been sent off for a stamp on a Saudi Arabian player in France's opening game, an incident that threatened to define his tournament as one of absence and disciplinary failure, rather than achievement. He returned. And what he produced in the matches that mattered, in the semi-final, in the final, was so complete and so decisive that the games in which he was absent became irrelevant. Footnotes to the story of what he did when he was there. France's path to the final was not straightforward. They were not the most attacking team in the tournament, not the most immediately spectacular. The football Jacquet's side played was often cautious, built on defensive organization, on the extraordinary holding midfield quality of Didier Deschamps, on the defensive intelligence of Marcel Desailly and Laurent Blanc and Lilian Thuram. They were functional, efficient, capable of the decisive moment when it was required. And in Zidane, operating in the space between the defensive midfield and the attacking line, finding passes, controlling tempo, doing things with the ball in tight spaces that other players simply couldn't do. They had someone who could make functional look like beautiful when the situation demanded it. The round of 16 against Paraguay. A match decided by a golden goal. The rule, introduced in 1998, that the first goal in extra time would end the match immediately, struck by Laurent Blanc in the 94th minute. France survived. The quarter-final against Italy. A match that went to extra time and then penalties. Deschamps scored. Thuram, who had scored 0 international goals before the tournament and who, against a tournament co-favourite, scored twice in the semi-final to put France through, produced the most unlikely, most important performance of his career in the semi-final against Croatia. 0-1 down at half-time, 1-1, then 2-1. Thuram, both goals, from a right-back who had never scored for France before, who would never score for France again. The World Cup's capacity for producing the unexpected from the unexpected person. For giving one player, in 1 month, the defining moment of a career that had been distinguished without ever being mythological, expressed itself in Thuram's semi-final with particular completeness. France were in the final. The final. The Stade de France, Saint-Denis. The 12th of July, 1998. France versus Brazil. The host nation against the defending champions. The most watched final in the tournament's history. An estimated television audience across the world of more than 1 billion people. But the match was defined before it began by what had happened in the hours preceding it. Ronaldo Luis Nazario de Lima, R9, the most discussed player in the world, the tournament's dominant figure, the player who had carried Brazil through the competition with performances of such explosive, devastating quality that he had been installed as the favourite to win the Golden Ball before the final had been played. On the morning of the final, Ronaldo suffered what appeared to be a convulsive episode in his hotel room. The details, exactly what happened, why it happened, how serious it was, have never been fully confirmed. What is known is that he was taken to hospital, that he was initially left off the team sheet, that his name was added back to the starting lineup shortly before kickoff, that the player who took the field for Brazil against France that evening was not the Ronaldo who had destroyed opponents throughout the tournament. He was there in body, but something was missing. Something essential. The spark, the sharpness, the specific electric quality of a player in the form of his life who knows exactly what to do and does it before the opposition has processed the possibility. He was absent in the most visible sense, present on the pitch, absent from it. And France, who had prepared for the Ronaldo who had terrorized every opponent, found themselves facing a shadow. 12 minutes. The first corner of the match. Emmanuel Petit swung the ball in from the left side. Zinedine Zidane, arriving at the near post from a run timed with the specific, unhurried precision of a player who had rehearsed this moment across thousands of training hours, met it with his head. The ball went into the top right corner of the net. 1-0. France. The Stade de France, 80,000 people, erupted with a force and a collective release that carried something beyond normal sporting celebration. This was the goal the country had been waiting for. Not just this tournament. This goal, this player, this moment. Zidane, the son of Algerian immigrants. The boy from the northern suburbs of Marseille, from La Castellane, from the neighborhood that France's established culture had spent decades treating as peripheral, as other, as somewhere you were from, rather than somewhere you were going to, had just scored in a World Cup final. For France. In France. In front of France. 27 minutes, another corner. Emmanuel Petit again. This time from the right side. Zidane arriving at the near post again. Another header. Another goal. 2-0. The same player. The same delivery. The same run. The same timing. But entirely different. Because the first goal had been the moment of arrival. The proof that it was happening, the declaration that this was not fortune, not accident, not the gift of an opposition team depleted by crisis, but the deliberate, prepared, entirely earned achievement of a player who had decided, who had always known, that this was what the night was for. Zidane had scored twice in a World Cup final. With his head, a player not known for heading. In the biggest match in football, when it mattered most. The game, in those moments, confirmed what the sport has always known and occasionally needs to be reminded. That the biggest stages produce the biggest performances from the biggest players. Not always, but often enough to sustain the belief. France won 3-0. Emmanuel Petit scored the third in injury time, arriving into the penalty area from his midfield position, receiving a pass from Thierry Henry, finishing with a composure that recalled the tournament's best moments. 3-0. France were world champions. The celebrations were unlike anything France had experienced. Not just in football terms, in national terms. The Champs-Élysées, the great boulevard of Paris, the road that had seen liberation parades and royal processions, and the full theatrical machinery of French national life, was filled with over 1 million people. Different. All different. French from Paris. French from Marseille. French from the banlieues and the departments and the overseas territories. French who had come from the former colonies that the French Empire had once governed, and that the French nation was still in 1998 still learning how to fully include. All of them together. All of them celebrating the same thing. A football team. A World Cup. A country that had, for one night, felt like the version of itself that it was capable of being. Black Blanc Beurre. It was not, of course, permanent. The social divisions that France in 1998 contained did not dissolve in the celebration. The issues of integration and identity and inequality that the squad's diversity had been held up as a symbol of transcending were not transcended. But for that night, for the Champs-Élysées and the Stade de France and the 100 million French people watching on screens across the country, it felt possible. It felt like proof. That football at its most significant moments could be more than a game. And Ronaldo, The story of France '98 cannot close without returning to Ronaldo, who stood on the pitch at the final whistle, having played a match in which he had been almost entirely absent, whose collapse in the hours before the final has never been fully explained, whose tournament, so brilliant, so dominant in the earlier rounds, had arrived at its most important moment and found him unable to be present for it. He was 21 years old, standing in the Stade de France, having just lost a World Cup final, in circumstances that nobody, not his teammates, not his coaches, not the watching world, fully understood. The questions that surrounded him in that moment would follow him for 4 years, about what had happened, about what it meant, about whether the player who had dazzled the tournament in the earlier rounds was gone permanently, or whether he would come back, and what coming back would look like. The answers to those questions belong to the next chapter. But 1998 was not only France's triumph and Ronaldo's tragedy. It was also the tournament that announced several things simultaneously: the emergence of African football as a genuine force, Cameroon and Nigeria and South Africa all participating, all producing moments that suggested the continent's football was developing faster than the established powers had anticipated. The confirmation of Croatia playing their first World Cup as an independent nation, producing football of exceptional quality under the management of Miroslav Blažević, finishing third as a genuine European force. The Golden Boot going to Davor Šuker, Croatia's striker, a player of extraordinary technical quality whose 6 goals came in a style that recalled the great European forwards of the previous generation, and the confirmation of Zinedine Zidane, not just as the best player in France, not just as the best player in Europe, but as the best player in the world, the player around whom France's entire World Cup had been built, who had delivered, in the 2 most important moments, in the 2 headers that settled the final, exactly what the team and the country and the tournament had required of him. Exactly. No more, no less. The stillness that defined him, the composure, the absence of panic, the complete presence in the moment regardless of the moment's magnitude, had found its fullest expression in Saint-Denis, on a July evening, in front of the world. But Zidane's World Cup story was not finished in 1998. It had a second chapter, a chapter set 8 years later, in Berlin, on another July evening, ending not with triumph but with a headbutt and a walk past a trophy he would never hold again. That chapter belongs to 2006, and it is one of the most dramatic, most human, most completely Zidane stories that football has ever produced. But before 2006, there was 2002, the tournament that belonged to 2 Brazilian players whose stories were, in their different ways, among the most extraordinary the World Cup has ever produced. One who had fallen in Paris in 1998 and risen again, and one who had danced through an entire tournament with a smile that made football look like the most joyful thing imaginable. Chapter 9, 2002, Ronaldo's Redemption and Ronaldinho's Magic. The 2002 World Cup began with a question. The same question that had been asked since the night of the 12th of July 1998, when Ronaldo had stood on the pitch at the Stade de France in the aftermath of a final he had barely inhabited. What had happened? And more importantly, what came next? For 4 years, the question followed him. Through the knee injuries that cost him 18 months of football between 1999 and 2001, through the comebacks and the relapses and the specific, grinding, physically and psychologically exhausting process of returning from injuries so serious that several people who knew the medical details said, quietly and privately, that they weren't certain he would play at the highest level again. through the return to Inter Milan, through the performances that showed glimpses of what he had been before 1998. The pace, the close control, the finishing, without yet recapturing the full, terrifying, opposition-dismantling force of the player who had made the world stop and stare. Through the move to Real Madrid in the summer of 2002, announced the week before the World Cup began, a transfer that would make him the most expensive player in history. Through all of it, the question remained, was Ronaldo still Ronaldo? The 2002 World Cup provided the answer. Japan and South Korea co-hosted the tournament. The first World Cup in Asia. The first co-hosted tournament in the competition's history. Both decisions were controversial. The co-hosting arrangement, born of a political compromise between two bids that FIFA couldn't choose between, produced logistical challenges and a format that required teams to travel between two countries with different languages, different infrastructure, different football cultures. And both Japan and South Korea proved across the tournament that the decisions had been correct, not just logistically, but in terms of what the tournament produced. Atmosphere, passion, colour, the specific energy of football arriving somewhere it had never fully arrived before. Not as an import, not as a curiosity, but as a genuine expression of the host nation's own cultures. The stadia were extraordinary. The crowds were extraordinary. And the football they witnessed was extraordinary. The tournament announced itself with an upset in its first week that recalled Algeria beating West Germany in 1982 in its capacity to destabilize the established order. Senegal versus France, the opening match of the tournament. France, the defending world champions, the team that had arrived in Japan and South Korea as the overwhelming favorites, not just to win the tournament, but to dominate it, to confirm that what they had achieved in 1998 had been the beginning of an era rather than a single moment. Versus Senegal, a country making its World Cup debut, a collection of players, many of whom played their club football in France, who had grown up in some cases as supporters of the French team they were now facing. Papa Bouba Diop scored in the 30th minute. Senegal won 1-0. France were beaten in the opening match of a World Cup defense by a team playing for the first time. They didn't score a single goal in the tournament, were eliminated in the group stage without scoring. The defending champions, the world's best team, out in the group stage without a goal. The World Cup's indifference to reputation, its capacity to make the expected irrelevant and produce the improbable, expressed itself in France's elimination with particular force. Zidane, injured for the first two group matches, returned for the final group game. But it was too late. France went home. The tournament they had come to defend belonged to someone else. South Korea, the home nation, who produced a run through the tournament that remains the most extraordinary sequence of results by a host nation in the history of the competition. They beat Spain in the quarter-finals, on penalties, after a match in which two apparently valid Spanish goals were disallowed by decisions that generated enormous controversy and have been debated ever since. They beat Germany, the most organized and physically imposing European side in the competition. Actually, no. They beat Portugal in the group stage. They beat Italy in the round of 16. On a golden goal from Ahn Jung-hwan, a player who at the time was on loan at Perugia in Italy and was released by his club owner after scoring the goal that eliminated Italy from the tournament. Released for scoring a goal for his country. They beat Spain in the quarter-finals on penalties. They lost to Germany in the semi-finals, finished fourth overall, a performance so extraordinary, produced partly through the specific ferocious home support that turned every South Korean match into an atmosphere of collective will that opponents found almost physically overwhelming, that it remains a subject of debate about where sporting achievement ends and fortune and circumstance begin. But the football they played, the energy, the organization, the refusal to accept that being the underdog meant accepting the underdog's outcome, was genuinely inspiring regardless of the controversy. A tournament co-hosted by two nations who were supposed to be the competition's background actors had produced one of its most dramatic storylines. But the 2002 World Cup's central narrative belonged to Brazil. To two players. One returning from the darkest moment of his career. One arriving at the tournament's center stage for the first time. Ronaldo. And Ronaldinho. Ronaldinho Gaúcho. Ronaldo de Assis Moreira. Born in Porto Alegre in 1980. The younger brother of a professional footballer whose career had never quite reached the heights his talent suggested. A player who had emerged from Brazilian football in the late 1990s with a set of qualities: the close control, the dribbling, the ability to produce in tight spaces, things that other players couldn't produce in open ones, that recalled the great Brazilian wide players of previous generations. He arrived at the 2002 World Cup having spent a season at Paris Saint-Germain that had been distinguished without being overwhelming, a player the football world knew about without yet having the complete picture. What the 2002 World Cup provided was the complete picture. And the picture was extraordinary. Brazil's group stage was functional rather than spectacular. They won their matches against Turkey, against China, against Costa Rica, with the specific, efficient quality of a team that contained individual brilliance and was carefully managing how much it was required to expose that brilliance in matches that didn't demand it. The knockout rounds were different. Brazil's round of 16 was against Belgium. Ronaldo scored twice. The first, a run-in behind the Belgian defence, a finish struck with his right foot low across the goalkeeper, was a reminder of what he had been before the injuries. The pace, the directness, the clinical precision of a finisher who doesn't think about missing. The second, collected from a through ball, one touch to control, one touch to finish, was evidence of the complete player returning. Not just the physical qualities, but the intelligence, the positioning, the understanding of where to be and when to be there, that separated the great strikers from the merely excellent. Ronaldo was back. Not fully, not yet, but recognizably, unmistakably back. The quarter-final against England. Brazil versus England. In Shizuoka. In a match that would produce one of the most discussed goals in the tournament's history. Not from Ronaldo. From Ronaldinho. Brazil led through Ronaldo, a first-half goal breaking between two England defenders, finishing before the goalkeeper had committed, when a free kick was awarded 35 yards from goal in the second half. Ronaldinho stood over it, assessed the position of the England goalkeeper David Seaman, standing on his line, fractionally off his left post, expecting a delivery into the penalty area, and chipped it directly at goal. A lofting, curving shot, struck with the outside of his right foot, producing a trajectory that began as though it might be a delivery, and then dipped, dropped, fell toward the goal in a way that Seaman, moving laterally, couldn't adjust to in time. The ball went over him, into the net. Seaman, experienced, excellent, one of the finest goalkeepers of his generation, stood with his hands on his head. 2-1. Brazil. The goal was immediately, furiously debated. Was it a shot? Was it a cross that went in? Did Ronaldinho intend it? Ronaldinho smiled. The specific, gap-toothed, entirely genuine smile of a man for whom football was the most enjoyable thing imaginable, was the answer. Not because it confirmed intent, but because it confirmed that whatever had happened, Ronaldinho was delighted by it. He was sent off minutes later for a challenge that produced a red card that the match officials might have reconsidered in a less tense atmosphere. Brazil held on with 10 men. England went home, and Ronaldinho, sent off, unable to play the semi-final, had nevertheless produced the moment that would travel furthest from the tournament. The chip, the smile, the combination of audacity and joy that would in 3 years make him the best player in the world. Brazil beat Turkey in the semi-final. Ronaldo scored. Brazil were in the final, against Germany, in Yokohama, on the 30th of June 2002. 4 years earlier, Ronaldo had stood in a stadium in Paris with nothing. No goals in the final, no performance. A mystery and a wound and a question that had no answer. He had spent 4 years carrying that, through the injuries, through the rehabilitation, through the months of not knowing whether the player he had been before 1998 was gone permanently, through the return, through the performances that suggested he was back, but hadn't yet confirmed it. He had carried it to Japan, and in the final, against Germany, against Oliver Kahn, who had been the best goalkeeper in the tournament, against a German team that had defended with the organization and physical commitment that had always characterized German football at its best. He put it down. 67th minute. Ronaldo ran onto a through ball. Kahn parried a shot. The ball fell. Ronaldo was there. Of course he was there. He scored. Kahn, the goalkeeper who had conceded almost nothing in the tournament, the player who had been so dominant throughout that he won the Golden Ball, the only goalkeeper ever to win the award as the tournament's best player. Kahn, who had been so good for so long, parried it to Ronaldo. 1-0, 79th minute. Kleberson drove forward, found Ronaldo in the penalty area. Ronaldo controlled, turned, shot. Kahn dived to his right. The ball went to his left. Brazil won the World Cup, their 5th title, the most in the tournament's history. At the final whistle, Ronaldo's face did something that recalled 1958 in Stockholm, the 17-year-old Pelé weeping with joy after Brazil's first World Cup. But it was different in the way that full comprehension is different from innocent happiness. Because Ronaldo knew what he had come through, knew the specific weight of what the previous 4 years had required of him, knew, in a way that the 17-year-old Pelé could not have known, exactly what it meant to have done this. To have returned from the darkest moment of his career, from the injuries, from the mystery, from the questions and the doubts and the people who had written, quietly but genuinely, that the player who had been the best in the world before 1998 might simply not exist anymore, and to have answered them in a World Cup final, with 2 goals against the best goalkeeper in the tournament, the gap-toothed smile, the haircut, the improbable, apparently inexplicable haircut that became as recognized as any of his goals, was the expression not just of happiness, but of vindication. The haircut, it must be addressed. Ronaldo arrived at the 2002 World Cup with a hairstyle that defied rational explanation. A single triangular section of hair at the front of his head, the rest shaved. A shape so specific and so deliberately unusual that photographers initially assumed they had caught him mid-cut, and that the full style would be revealed shortly, It was the full style. He wore it throughout the tournament. Why? He said later that he had cut it to distract attention from a scar on his head. He said that his son liked it. He said various things at various times that gave no definitive explanation. The football world accepted it, because the football world in 2002 was watching Ronaldo score goals in a World Cup final and score the winning goal against England and carry Brazil to the trophy they had been building towards since the injury-blighted collapse of 1998. The haircut was irrelevant, and yet the haircut was everywhere. Children across Brazil imitated it. Children across the world imitated it. It became somehow as permanent a part of the 2002 World Cup's image as any of the goals. The absurdity of football, the specific, wonderful, completely unexplainable absurdity of a sport that can produce the most technically sublime moments in human athletic achievement and simultaneously make the entire world argue about a haircut. Brazil's 2002 triumph was the last time they won the World Cup, the last time the most successful football nation in the tournament's history lifted the trophy. Ronaldo played 2 more World Cups. In 2006, he was still capable of brilliance, scoring in the tournament, providing moments that recalled the player he had been, but was operating in the shadow of a Brazilian team that had not progressed as it should have, and that exited in the quarterfinals. In 2010, he made the squad but barely featured. His international career ended with 62 goals for Brazil, the record that stood until it was broken by another Brazilian, by the player who had scored the chip against England in 2002 with a smile, who had grown, in the years after Japan and South Korea, from an extraordinary talent into something more, into the best player in the world, who had won the Ballon d'Or in 2004 and 2005, who had won the Champions League with Barcelona, who had played football in those years with a joy and a technical brilliance that recalled Garrincha, the man from Pau Grande with the curved legs, more than any player since, Ronaldinho, whose World Cup story had its peak in 2002 and never quite reached those heights again in the tournament. Injury and circumstance, and the specific, unpredictable fortune that the World Cup distributes without reference to what players deserve, conspiring to limit his subsequent impact, but who left the 2002 tournament with an image, the chip, the smile. The specific combination of audacity and delight that is the most joyful expression of what football can be. 2002 was the last truly South American World Cup. Not in terms of location. The tournament has subsequently been held in Germany, South Africa, Brazil, Russia, Qatar, but in terms of spirit. In terms of the feeling present across multiple teams and multiple matches and the tournament's overall character, that football in its most expressive, most joyful, most individualistic form was at its center. The 2002 World Cup had Ronaldo's redemption, had Ronaldinho's magic, had Senegal's historic upset and South Korea's impossible run, and Turkey's emergence and the extraordinary theatrical drama of a tournament held in places that football had not previously called home. It had everything. It was the last World Cup of a particular kind of football, the football of Pelé and Garrincha and Zico and Maradona and Romario and Bebeto and R9 and Ronaldinho, the lineage of South American genius that had defined the tournament's greatest moments from 1958 onwards. Still present in 2002, still capable of producing its most essential quality. The feeling, watching Ronaldinho receive the ball wide, or watching Ronaldo run onto a through ball in a final, that something was about to happen that you had never seen before, and might never see again. That feeling, the World Cup's most essential promise, kept in 2002 one final time. Before the game changed, before the European clubs and the European structures and the physical demands of the modern game began to compress the space in which that kind of genius operated. before the tournament became something different. Still extraordinary, but different. Chapter 10. 2006. Zidane's last dance. Every great story needs an ending, not a tidy one, not a comfortable one, not the kind of ending that wraps everything into the shape that the story seemed to be building toward, but an ending that is true, that captures, in a single moment, a single image, a single act, everything essential about the person at the center of it. Zinedine Zidane's career ended in Berlin on the 9th of July 2006. Not with a goal, not with a trophy, not with the specific, complete, deserved vindication that the finest player of his generation had earned across 20 years of professional football. With a headbutt and a walk past the World Cup trophy he would never hold again. Head up, eyes forward, entirely himself. To the end. Germany 2006 was, in many ways, the most anticipated World Cup since France 1998. The intervening tournaments, the extraordinary drama of Japan and South Korea, had produced football of extraordinary quality and storylines of remarkable power. But 2006 felt different, because 2006 was the last tournament of a generation. The generation that had defined football across the previous decade, Zidane, Ronaldo R9, Ronaldinho at the peak of his powers, Thierry Henry, Raúl, Pavel Nedved, Cafu, Roberto Carlos, was aging. Not finished, not irrelevant, but at the stage where every tournament might be the last, where the question of who was watching, of whether this specific combination of players and possibilities would exist again, gave every match a weight that purely competitive football couldn't carry alone. The world understood that something was ending and wanted to watch the ending. Germany as a host brought everything the tournament needed: organization, passion, the specific atmosphere of a football-mad nation hosting the game at its highest level with a thoroughness and a commitment that made the tournament feel, from the first match to the last, like an occasion that understood its own significance. The stadia were magnificent. The fan zones, a German innovation, large public spaces where supporters gathered to watch matches on giant screens, created a carnival atmosphere across the host cities that extended the tournament beyond the grounds and into the streets. It was by common agreement one of the finest tournaments in terms of organization and atmosphere that the sport had produced, and the football delivered. Not always beautifully, not with the sustained philosophical commitment to quality of 1982, but with the specific, dramatic, emotionally intense quality of a competition in which every match carried genuine consequence, and the margins between victory and elimination were consistently, agonizingly thin. The host nation's story was its own chapter. Germany had arrived at the tournament as co-hosts rather than title favorites. Their squad was young, relatively inexperienced at the highest level, built around a generation of players who were developing rapidly, but who hadn't yet produced the results that confirmed their potential. Jürgen Klinsmann, the former striker who had become Germany's coach in an appointment that had been controversial at the time, had spent 2 years rebuilding the national team's playing philosophy, making them more attacking, more dynamic, less reliant on the defensive solidity and physical organization that had characterized German football at its most successful. The new Germany pressed, attacked with width and pace and the specific, direct energy of a team that had been told and had believed that their football should be an expression of something rather than a defensive negation of the opposition's strengths. They beat Costa Rica 4-2 in the opening match, scored 8 goals in the group stage, beat Sweden in the round of 16, beat Argentina in the quarter-finals on penalties. In a match so close, so physically and emotionally intense, so laden with the specific history of two nations who had met in World Cup finals and semi-finals across 4 decades, that the penalty shootout felt less like a lottery and more like an inevitability. The crowd's reaction to Germany's victory, the explosion of noise, the release of something that had been building across the entire tournament, the specific emotional weight of a host nation reaching a World Cup semi-final, was among the most visceral things a football match had produced in years. Germany lost the semi-final to Italy. Fabio Grosso scored in the 119th minute, with 1 minute of extra time remaining, with the match seemingly destined for penalties, with both teams having organised so completely that goals had appeared impossible for almost 2 hours. Grosso. A goal that arrived not from the expected player, not from the tournament's designated heroes, but from a left-back arriving late into the penalty area in the dying seconds of extra time. The World Cup's capacity for finding unlikely vessels for its most important moments. Grosso ran toward the corner flag. Arms wide, eyes wild, the expression of a man who has done something he didn't fully believe was possible. Italy won. Germany went home. But the tournament they had hosted, the atmosphere they had created, the football they had played, the extraordinary semi-final run that had made a nation rediscover its relationship with its own national team, was one of the great host nation stories in the competition's history. Brazil arrived in 2006 as favourites, with Ronaldinho at the absolute peak of his powers, the reigning Ballon d'Or winner, the most discussed player in the world, the man who had spent the previous 2 seasons at Barcelona producing football of such extraordinary quality, the goal against Chelsea in the Champions League, bicycle kick against Villarreal, the performances that had made him the most watched player on the planet, that the expectation around him in Germany was enormous. And he didn't deliver it. Not fully. Not at the level the tournament and the expectation demanded. He scored. He created. He produced moments of the specific joyful Ronaldinho quality that reminded you why everyone had been watching him. But he was not the force of nature that the previous 2 seasons had suggested he might be. Brazil were eliminated in the quarter-finals by France. 1-0. A single Thierry Henry goal. Zidane, recalled from semi-retirement, brought back to the French squad for one final tournament, performing across Germany with a quality that recalled the player of 1998 while carrying the additional authority of a man who understood, in ways that younger players couldn't, exactly what these matches meant. Controlling the match against Brazil from the midfield. Older. Slower in the ways that 34-year-olds are slower. But more intelligent. More present. More completely in command of the specific, unhurried game intelligence that had always been his greatest quality. Ronaldinho watched from the pitch as France eliminated Brazil. And his World Cup story, which had peaked so completely in 2002, ended without the tournament redemption that the previous 4 years of club brilliance had seemed to promise. The World Cup does not reward club form. It rewards presence. And in Germany, Zidane was more present than anyone. France's semi-final against Portugal? Zidane against Cristiano Ronaldo. The oldest and newest versions of the most technically gifted footballer in the world. Zidane, 34 in his last tournament, playing with the specific, slightly melancholy authority of someone who knows they are at the end and is determined to make the end worthy of everything that came before it. Ronaldo, 21, in his first tournament as a genuine world-class figure. carrying Portugal forward with a combination of individual quality and competitive intensity that was establishing him that summer as the player who would define the next decade. Portugal pressed. France defended. A penalty. Zidane, who else? He ran up, struck it, not with power. Not with the thundering certainty of a player trying to beat the goalkeeper through force. With a panenka. A chip down the middle as the goalkeeper dived to his right. The ball bounced. Off the underside of the crossbar, down, over the line. 1-0. France. The audacity of it, in a World Cup semi-final, against a goalkeeper who knew Zidane's history, who had prepared for him, who was watching him approach and trying to read what was coming. And Zidane, 34 years old in his last tournament, chose the panenka, chose the most technically demanding, the most psychologically exposed, the most completely confident penalty a player can attempt, and executed it perfectly. France won 1-0. Into the final. The final. Berlin. The Olympia Stadion. The 9th of July 2006. France versus Italy. A match between the two nations that had produced more World Cup winners than any other at that point. France, the reigning champions of 1998. Italy, the winners of 1982 and 1938 and 1934. A final that deserved an occasion. That got one. Zidane scored in the 7th minute, a penalty. Struck with a technique so specific, so entirely unlike any other penalty ever taken in a World Cup final, that it announced immediately that what was happening was not conventional. He chipped it, aimed at the center of the goal, high, the ball striking the underside of the crossbar and dropping over the line. Not quite a panenka. The ball was struck higher, with less spin, but in the same tradition, the same philosophy. The penalty as artistic statement rather than simple execution. The ball bounced back off the post, struck the goalkeeper Gianluigi Buffon, crossed the line. 1-0. And the final, the match that Zidane had been building toward all tournament, the occasion that his final World Cup had been building toward for 4 years, began. Italy equalized through Marco Materazzi. A header from a corner, 1-1. And the match that followed, across the remaining 80 minutes of normal time and then 30 minutes of extra time, was the specific, tight, defensively organized football that Italy and France both specialized in. Moments of quality, moments of tension, long stretches of caution. Both teams capable of the decisive moment, but neither able to produce it consistently enough to break the other's organization. Zidane was everywhere, controlling, distributing, arriving in unexpected positions, producing in the 82nd minute a header from a corner arriving at the near post, struck with the power and the timing that recalled the headers of 1998 in Saint-Denis, that Buffon somehow saved. A save that Zidane reacted to, not with frustration, but with the specific, slightly incredulous expression of a player who had asked the game for everything, and found that the game, in this final hour, was asking him to ask again. The match went to extra time. 110 minutes. France attacking. Zidane driving. And then, in a moment so sudden, so completely without visible warning, so entirely outside the normal register of what a World Cup final produces, everything changed. Zidane and Marco Materazzi, walking side by side. Whatever was said, and what was said has been variously reported, denied, claimed, and disputed across the years since. produced in Zidane a response that was as quick and as complete and as totally committed as anything he had done with a football in his career. He stopped walking, turned, and headbutted Materazzi in the chest, in full view of the referee, who produced the red card. Zidane, who had been announced in the hours before the match as the winner of the Golden Ball, the tournament's best player, walked off the pitch, past the World Cup trophy, without looking at it, past the FIFA officials arranging the ceremony that he would not be part of, without acknowledgement, head up, into the tunnel, out of football. The silence that followed in the stadium was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of something larger, of an audience processing the simultaneous awareness that something extraordinary and something terrible had just happened in the same moment, that the greatest player of his generation had just ended his career with an act of violence in a World Cup final, that the narrative, the perfect, complete, deserved narrative of a player returning for one final tournament and lifting the trophy, had collapsed into something more human, more complicated, more true to what Zidane had always been, because Zidane had never been only the composure, the stillness, the unhurried, perfectly calibrated, emotionally controlled player who produced exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. He had also been the red cards, the suspension from the 1998 tournament, the moments, rare but real, when the fire beneath the composure found a way out. The headbutt was that fire, not the composure, not the career's defining quality, but the other thing, the thing that had always been there beneath it. And the World Cup final, the highest, most exposed, most watched stage in the sport, was where it finally, irrevocably, permanently emerged. Italy won the penalty shootout. Trezeguet missed for France. His penalty struck the crossbar, bounced down, didn't cross the line. Italy scored their penalties. Fabio Grosso, who had scored the semi-final winner against Germany, struck the final penalty. Italy were world champions, their fourth title, equaling Brazil's record at the time. And Zidane, in the dressing room, having watched the shootout on a monitor in the tunnel, was asked in the days and weeks that followed about the headbutt, about Materazzi, about the moment. He said he didn't regret it, not because he was proud of it, but because he was made of things he was made of. And in that moment, in that situation, what he was made of had expressed itself. He said he would rather have done what he did than not done it, and regretted the inaction. It was not an apology. It was an explanation, in a language that was entirely Zidane's. The language of a man who had always done things his own way, who had always, in the end, been exactly himself, regardless of the cost. The 2006 World Cup was also the tournament of other stories. Of Ghana's debut, the first sub-Saharan African nation to reach the knockout rounds of a World Cup as a representative of their region. Playing football of genuine quality and producing moments that suggested the continent's development was accelerating. Of Australia's return, their first World Cup since 1974, producing a round of 16 appearances that announced the Socceroos as a genuine competitive force. Of the Portuguese generation, Cristiano Ronaldo, Luis Figo, in his last World Cup, 33 years old, still capable of moments that recalled the player who had been the best in the world at the turn of the millennium. Deco, Manich, a squad of extraordinary individual talent that finished fourth, that lost to France in the semi-final, that produced football good enough to reach the last four, but not quite good enough, or not quite fortunate enough to go further. Ronaldo scored 1 goal, contributed assists and creative play that suggested the transformation from wide player to complete footballer was already underway. Wept after Portugal's defeat, because Ronaldo wept easily and genuinely in those years. The competitive intensity expressing itself through tears as naturally as through goals. And Figo, who played his last World Cup in Germany, who had spent a decade as one of the finest wide players the game had produced, who had crossed from Barcelona to Real Madrid in the most controversial transfer of the modern era, and had been a pig's head at the Camp Nou, who ended his World Cup career with no title, no final, no moment that confirmed, in the way that World Cup winners get confirmed, that the talent had been rewarded, like Zico before him, like so many of the genuinely great. The World Cup gave them everything except the one thing that the sport measures everything by. 2006 closed the door on an era. Not immediately, not with any formal announcement, but with the specific feeling booked present in the tournament's final images, in Zidane's walk past the trophy and Figo's quiet exit and Ronaldo R9's last appearance for Brazil, that what had defined the previous decade of international football was completing itself. The players who had given the World Cup its greatest stories across that period were moving toward the end. Zidane was finished. Ronaldo R9 would play 2 more tournaments, but not as the player he had been. Ronaldinho would never quite recapture the heights of 2002 on the international stage. The game was changing. The pressing systems were becoming more dominant. The physical demands were increasing. The space in which the great individual, the Zidane, the Maradona, the Ronaldinho, had always operated was compressing, and into the space that was left. A new generation was arriving, players who had grown up watching the tournaments we have described, who had formed their understanding of what football could be from the images and the moments and the stories that the World Cup had produced across 6 decades. Who were ready in 2010 and 2014 and 2018 and 2022 to write their own chapters. But before those chapters, before the Spain of Xavi and Iniesta and Villa, before Germany's 7-1, before the long, painful, finally glorious story of Messi and Argentina, there was one more story from 2006 that deserves its proper space. Not a nation story, not a player's redemption, a single moment, arcane in its origin, cosmic in its scale, producing more debate than almost anything in the history of the sport. Zidane's headbutt, which was not in the end just a headbutt, it was a question about what we demand of the players who carry the weight of a tournament, about what we are allowed to expect of genius, about whether the composure that defines the greatest players, the stillness, the calm, the seemingly inexhaustible ability to be present in the moment regardless of pressure, is a characteristic or a performance, and about what happens when the performance ends, when the man beneath the genius emerges, when the player does the human thing instead of the perfect thing. Zidane did the human thing in the most watched moment of the most watched tournament in the world. And the debate about what it meant, about whether it diminished him, about whether the headbutt and the genius were the same person, or 2 different people sharing one body, has never fully resolved. Because the answer is not simple. He was both. He was always both. The composure and the fire. The headers in Saint-Denis and the headbutt in Berlin. The player who could do anything with a football and the man who, in one moment, chose to do something with his head that had nothing to do with football at all. He was Zidane. Completely. Chapter 11. The Messi era and the long wait. There are stories that take time. Not because the subject is complicated. Not because the events are difficult to describe. But because the story itself, the arc of it, the shape from beginning to end, requires time to complete. Requires patience. Requires the specific, sometimes agonizing experience of watching something that should be inevitable refuse, again and again, to become inevitable. The story of Lionel Messi and the World Cup is that kind of story. It begins in 2006, in Germany, with a 19-year-old from Rosario who came off the bench in Argentina's round of 16 match against Mexico, and scored a goal of such complete, mature, technically flawless quality that the entire stadium, which had come to watch a World Cup match, stopped and understood that it was watching something else. A beginning. The beginning of the most important relationship in the history of the tournament. Between a player and a competition. Between a man and the one thing that his talent, extraordinary as it was, could not simply produce by being extraordinary. The World Cup trophy. Lionel Messi won everything. In the years between his World Cup debut in 2006 and his final in 2022, 16 years, 5 tournaments, the longest sustained period of individual excellence at the highest level of club football the sport has ever produced. He won everything that could be won. 6 Ballon d'Or awards, 4 Champions Leagues, 10 La Liga titles, the Copa del Rey, everything that Barcelona in those extraordinary years under Guardiola and beyond could offer. He was the best player in the world, not debatably, not in most people's opinion, not with qualifications and caveats that acknowledged the legitimate claims of Cristiano Ronaldo and the other extraordinary players of the era. Simply, clearly, obviously, the best. And yet, the World Cup, the competition that the sport considers the ultimate validation, the tournament that places the individual achievement of club football into a different context, a national context, a collective context, the specific context of representing not a club that has assembled the best players money can buy, but a country whose footballers are whoever the country produces. The World Cup was not his. Not yet. Argentina reached the quarter-finals, beaten by Germany on penalties. Messi was 19, a squad member rather than the central figure. José Pekerman's Argentina was built around the previous generation, Riquelme, Crespo, Saviola, with Messi as the brilliant young addition rather than the team's axis. He scored once, contributed flashes of the player he was becoming, and went home in the quarter-finals, as Argentina often did. South Africa, the first World Cup held on the African continent, an occasion of such cultural and political significance, the hosting of the world's largest sporting event by a country that had, 16 years earlier, been emerging from apartheid, that the football was almost secondary to the moment. Almost. Vuvuzelas, the plastic horns that produced a sustained, omnipresent, slightly maddening drone that became the tournament's sonic signature. Discussed endlessly, complained about constantly. Representings, for those willing to see past the noise, the specific, authentic, exuberant football culture of South Africa expressing itself through the only medium available. The football was, for much of the tournament, tight and cautious. The knockout rounds were decided by small margins, and in Argentina's camp a new dynamic had arrived. Diego Maradona was the coach, an appointment so audacious, so clearly based on the desire to have the greatest Argentine player in history involved in the national team's preparation, regardless of his coaching credentials. that football people spent the months before the tournament arguing about whether it was genius or folly? The answer was both. Maradona's Argentina played with a freedom and an attacking commitment that the previous year's qualifying campaign, in which Argentina had barely qualified, had not suggested they possessed. They beat South Korea 4-1 in the group stage. Higuaín scored a hat-trick. They beat Mexico 3-1 in the round of 16. Tevez and Higuaín and the explosive, direct football that Maradona had encouraged, more by creating an environment of belief and freedom than by producing any particularly sophisticated tactical framework, carried them through. Messi was magnificent, creating, driving, producing moments of individual quality that recalled his best Barcelona performances translated into the World Cup context, and scoring 0 goals. 0. In 5 matches. The quarter-final against Germany. Argentina were dismantled. 4-0. A performance of such complete, comprehensive German dominance, organised, physical, technically precise, that it felt less like a quarter-final than a statement. Germany were announcing something. About themselves. About what they were becoming. About the direction that international football was moving. Toward the collective, the pressed, the physically dynamic and tactically sophisticated, and away from the individual genius and creative freedom that Argentina, under Maradona, had tried to build around. Argentina went home. Maradona left his position shortly after. And Messi, who had produced the most creative displays of any player in the tournament without scoring a goal, began to carry a different kind of weight. Not just the expectation of an extraordinary player, the expectation of a player who was supposed to win Argentina the World Cup, and hadn't, and might never. Because the World Cup, unlike the Champions League, was not something you could dominate through individual genius sustained across a season. It was something else. Something that required different things. That asked questions of a player that the No Camp, with its organized support structures and its perfectly designed systems, did not ask. Brazil. The tournament that Brazil had waited 12 years to host again. The country that had been building toward this moment, had lobbied for it, had constructed stadiums for it, had invested billions in it, with the specific, complicated, deeply personal motivation of a nation that had last hosted in 1950 and remembered what had happened. The Maracanazo, the silence of 200,000 people, the wound that had never fully closed. Brazil in 2014 wanted to exercise 1950. What they got instead was something they hadn't imagined. Something that produced a new word. But before that, Argentina. Messi. His 3rd World Cup. 27 years old. In the absolute peak of his powers. Playing with a freedom and a directness and a complete utter confidence in his own ability that the previous 2 tournaments, where the weight of expectation had sometimes seemed to press down on the specific space-dependent quality of his play, had not always produced. He scored 4 goals in the group stage. Against Bosnia. Against Iran. Against Nigeria. Each one the expression of a player who had arrived in Brazil with the specific, settled authority of someone who had decided that this was the time. That the years of watching the World Cup trophy go to someone else, watching Spain win it in 2010 with a system built around the players he competed against and alongside at Barcelona, were over. That this tournament was his. Argentina reached the final, against Germany, in the Maracana, where the Maracanazo had happened 64 years earlier. And the final was, by the standards of World Cup finals, tight, tense, occasionally excellent and sometimes frustrating in the way that matches between two very good, very well-organized teams often are, when both sides understand the stakes. 0-0 after 90 minutes, 0-0 after extra time. Almost in extra time, in the 113th minute, with the match seemingly destined for penalties, Mario Götze received the ball on the left side of the Argentina penalty area. Chest control. Volley, right foot, into the net. Germany won the World Cup. Messi, who had been Argentina's best player across the tournament, who had created and driven and produced moments of individual quality that no other player at the tournament could match, walked up to collect his golden ball as the tournament's best player, in a tournament he hadn't won. The image of Messi holding the golden ball on the presentation podium as Germany celebrated behind him became one of the defining images of his career. Not because of what it showed, because of what it didn't show. The trophy. The years between 2014 and 2018 were the darkest in Messi's international career, not because he played badly, because the gap between what he produced and what it resulted in became so stark, so persistent, so apparently unbridgeable that the question, asked quietly in 2010, more loudly in 2014, became an accusation. He couldn't do it for Argentina. The accusation was not entirely fair. Argentina's squad, beyond Messi, was not the squad of a team capable of winning a World Cup. The structures around him, the coaching, the tactical framework, the collective organization, were not what he had at Barcelona, but the accusation wasn't entirely unfair either. Because the World Cup, unlike the Champions League, unlike La Liga, requires a player to elevate the players around him rather than operating within a system designed to maximize what he does best. And there were questions about whether Messi, the genius of positional freedom, the player who needed the game to be organized around his qualities, could be the player who organized the game himself, who led, who carried, who was the reason Argentina won rather than the reason Argentina played beautifully while losing. The Copa America final. Argentina versus Chile. Penalties. Messi stepped up and struck his penalty over the bar. Argentina lost. And Messi, weeping, desolate, standing on the pitch, announced his retirement from international football. He was 29 years old. He said he had given everything, that it wasn't enough, that the pain of losing again in a final in the moment when everything was at stake was more than he was willing to keep subjecting himself to. The retirement lasted weeks. He came back, because he always came back, because the World Cup, the one thing he hadn't won, was still there, still waiting. Russia, Messi's fourth World Cup, 31 years old, and the tournament where the story seemed finally to be moving toward its ending, where the question, could Messi win a World Cup, would receive its definitive answer. Argentina's group stage was chaotic. They drew with Iceland, lost to Croatia, needed to beat Nigeria in the final group match to advance. They won 2-1. Messi scored. A goal of stunning technique, a run, a touch to control a long ball. A first-time finish, struck on the run that recalled every extraordinary goal he had scored across his career while being entirely its own thing. But the round of 16 brought France, and Kylian Mbappé. France 4, Argentina 3. One of the great knockout matches in the tournament's history. Both sides scoring. Both sides incapable of the defensive organization that the occasion demanded. both sides producing moments of such attacking quality that the match felt less like a World Cup round of 16 and more like the final 12 years too early. Mbappé scored twice. A 19-year-old French forward of such extraordinary pace and technical quality that his performances in Russia announced, unmistakably and permanently, that he was the next player. The next Ronaldo. The next Zidane. The next name that would define the tournament's next decade. Messi was out. Again. In the round of 16. At 31. With everyone understood. One more chance. In 2022, in Qatar, France won the 2018 World Cup in a final against Croatia that produced, across its 120 minutes, the specific drama that World Cup finals at their best deliver. Croatia, who'd beaten Argentina and England and Denmark on the way to the final, led 1-0 in the first half through Ivan Perisic, fell behind through an unusual own goal, fell further behind, were 4-1 down, and scored again. Perisic, then Mandzukic, 4-2. France held. Mbappé had scored in the final, the first teenager to do so since Pelé in 1958. The comparison was made immediately. And this time, unlike some premature comparisons that the sport has made across its history, it felt earned. Because Mbappé in Russia had produced a tournament performance of such complete, physical, technically accomplished quality that the comparison wasn't hyperbole. It was assessment. Luka Modric won the Golden Ball, the recognition for a tournament in which the Croatian midfielder, 32 years old, small, seemingly unimpressive in the physical terms that the modern game increasingly prioritized, had produced the finest, individual sustained performance of any player in the competition, controlling matches from the center of the pitch, creating for others, defending when required, doing the full range of what the position demanded, week after week, across 7 matches. Croatia went home without the trophy, with the knowledge that what they had achieved, reaching a World Cup final as a nation of 4 million people, was the most complete expression of collective football in the tournament's history. Qatar, the most controversial location in the tournament's history. Awarded to a small Gulf state with no football culture, no natural infrastructure for the event, no obvious claim to host the world's largest sporting occasion beyond the financial resources, to build the stadiums, and the political will to acquire the right. The decision to award Qatar the 2022 World Cup produced a controversy that never fully resolved, about the conditions in which the stadiums were built, about the workers who built them, about the rights of the LGBTQ+ community in a country where homosexuality was illegal, about whether the tournament had been awarded corruptly. The investigations and prosecutions that followed the decision suggested that the FIFA voting process had been deeply compromised. The World Cup was played in November and December, moved from its traditional summer window because Qatar's summer heat was genuinely incompatible with playing football, producing the first Winter World Cup in the tournament's history. It was strange, disorienting in ways that the participants and the audience struggled to fully articulate. The atmosphere, indoor stadiums, corporate crowd management, the specific, slightly artificial quality of an event happening somewhere it hadn't grown organically, was unlike any previous World Cup. And yet, the football was extraordinary. Saudi Arabia beat Argentina in the group stage on the 22nd of November 2022. Messi had scored in the first half from the penalty spot. Argentina led 1-0 at half-time. And then, Saleh al-Shehri. Then Salem al-Dawsari. 2-1. Saudi Arabia against Argentina with Messi in a World Cup group stage. The shock replaying 1950, replaying Algeria in 1982, replaying Senegal against France in 2002, expressed itself immediately across the football world. Argentina were not out. 2 group matches remained. They won both. But the specific, frightening vulnerability of the Messi-Argentina relationship with the World Cup had announced itself one final time. Even now. Even at 35, even in his last tournament, the competition that had refused to be straightforward for him, across 2 decades of extraordinary football, was refusing to be straightforward still. Argentina recovered, won their remaining group matches, beat Australia in the round of 16, beat the Netherlands in the quarter-finals. In a match of such extraordinary tension, such physical and emotional intensity, such moments of genuine anger and confrontation between the sides, that it recalled the great World Cup quarter-finals of previous decades. The match went to extra time, went to penalties. Argentina won. Messi scoring and celebrating with the specific, slightly unhinged passion of a player who had been in this situation too many times before. Who was not calm, who was not composed, who was angry and fierce and absolutely committed in a way that the previous decade of watching him in World Cups had not always produced. This was a different Messi. Older, more furious, more personally invested in the outcome in a way that youth, which can absorb loss and move forward to the next attempt, no longer offered him. This was his last attempt, and he knew it, and everyone watching knew it. The semi-final against Croatia. Modric again, 37 years old, still the most complete midfielder in the world. Messi again, 35, still the most complete footballer in the world. Argentina won 3-0. Messi scored and assisted. Julian Alvarez and the young Manchester City striker, 22 years old, playing with the freedom and the joy of a player for whom the World Cup was still a gift rather than an obligation, scored twice. Argentina were in the final, against France, against Mbappé, the old and the new. The long wait and the immediate future, the final. The 18th of December 2022, Lusail Stadium. Qatar, Argentina versus France. A match that produced, across 120 minutes in a penalty shootout, what many people who watched it immediately called the greatest World Cup final ever played. Not the most beautiful, not the most technically exquisite, but the most dramatic, the most emotionally complete. The match that contained, in a single evening, the full range of what the World Cup promises, and occasionally, magnificently, delivers. Argentina led 2-0 at 79 minutes. Messi had scored a penalty. Angel Di Maria, who had spent the weeks before the tournament managing an injury, who had been uncertain to play, who had arrived in Qatar as a question mark and had answered it repeatedly, scored a magnificent second. France were being outplayed and Argentina were winning the World Cup. And then, Kylian Mbappé. 3 minutes. 2 goals, a penalty. A volley from the edge of the penalty area, struck with his left foot before the ball had touched the ground, arriving in the net before the goalkeeper had completed his dive. 2-2, the equaliser coming so quickly, so completely out of nothing. France had been so thoroughly second to Argentina across the match's first 80 minutes that the entire stadium and the billions watching across the world processed it with the same stunned disbelief. It was 2-2. Argentina needed to score again. So did France. Extra time. 108th minute. Messi. Turning in the penalty area from close range, scoring. 3-2. The goal that would win Argentina the World Cup. The goal that 35 years of life and 5 World Cups and all the heartbreak and the near misses and the Copa America losses and the retirement that lasted weeks and the return and the years of carrying more than any player should have been asked to carry, had been building toward. Mbappe, who had scored twice, was not finished. In the 118th minute, a penalty. His third goal. 3-3. Mbappe's hat-trick. In a World Cup final. At 23 years old. The tournament's greatest individual scoring performance in a final since Hurst in 1966. Penalties. The shootout was everything. The tension was almost physical. Both sides scoring. Until Kingsley Coman's penalty was saved by Emiliano Martinez, the Argentine goalkeeper, who had been the tournament's best throughout, whose save and presence and extraordinary ability to read the penalty taker's intentions had been as significant as any outfield performance. Diving to his right, parrying, the ball away. Aurelien Tchouameni missed. Gonzalo Montiel stepped up, struck it, scored. Argentina won the World Cup. The image, Messi, running. Arms wide. Mouth open. Running toward his teammates, who were running toward him. The collision of bodies in the center of the pitch. The pile of players, the tears. The specific, physical, completely uncontrolled release of something that had been contained for too long, for too many years, for too many near misses, for too many moments when the trophy had been there, visible, possible, seemingly within reach, and had not arrived. It arrived now, in Qatar, at 35, in his last World Cup. With a final against France that had required him to score in normal time and watch his team throw away a 2-goal lead and see Mbappe score a hat-trick and hold his nerve through a penalty shootout in front of the entire world. The maximum possible difficulty. The complete, exhausting, finally victorious ending. Messi lifted the trophy. With the bisht, the traditional black and gold Arab robe, placed over his shoulders by the Emir of Qatar in the moments before the presentation. A gesture of honor in Arab culture. The image of Messi lifting the World Cup in the bisht. The golden trim catching the stadium lights. The trophy held above his head. The tears and the crowd. And the moment that the sport had been building toward for 16 years. Became immediately, permanently one of the most iconic images in the history of sport. Not just football, sport. Because it captured something that transcended the result. It captured what it means to want something for a very long time. To have the talent to deserve it. To watch it not arrive, again and again. To keep coming back. To refuse to accept that the story was over before it had its proper ending. And to finally, in the last possible chapter, receive it. The Messi era of the World Cup, which began in Germany in 2006 with a 19-year-old coming off the bench and ended in Qatar in 2022 with a 35-year-old lifting the trophy, is the most complete individual narrative the tournament has ever produced. Not the most dominant. Maradona in 1986 was more dominant. Not the most statistically extraordinary. Ronaldo R9 in 2002 was more decisive, but the most complete. Because it had everything. The beginning full of promise. The middle full of near misses. The low points, the Copa America final, and the tears and the retirement that made the eventual triumph feel earned rather than simply received. And the ending, the proper, complete, emotionally sufficient ending in the final, against the best, through the maximum difficulty, with his country's shirt, with the trophy above his head, the long wait over. Chapter 12. The greatest moments, games and players. Some stories need a final chapter that pauses, that steps back from the narrative, from the chronological forward-moving telling of events and eras and tournaments, and looks at the whole, at what the World Cup has produced across nearly a century, not as a timeline, but as a gallery, a collection of the moments and the matches and the players who, taken together, form the fullest possible picture of what the tournament is and what it has meant. This is that chapter. Not a ranking, not a hierarchy, not a definitive list that settles the arguments that football people have been having for decades and will continue having for decades more. But a gathering, a room where the greatest things the World Cup has produced exist simultaneously, where the Maracanazo and Maradona's goal and Zidane's headers and Ronaldo's redemption and Messi's final can all be present at once, each one illuminating the others, each one adding something to the complete picture that none of them can provide alone. The moments. The Maracanazo. 1950. 200,000 people. The largest crowd ever to attend a football match. In a stadium built specifically for Brazil's coronation as world champions. And the silence, the specific, spreading, almost incomprehensible silence that followed Baggio's goal in the 79th minute. The silence of a crowd that had come to celebrate and found itself instead at the end of something, at the beginning of a wound that would take 64 years to heal. The Maracanazo is not just a football result, it is the World Cup's first great demonstration of its own essential quality. That no result is guaranteed, that no tournament is won before it is played, that football at its most significant moments is completely indifferent to what the story seemed to be building toward. The Maracanazo is the tournament's foundation myth. The original proof that it was real, that it mattered, that results at a World Cup could produce the specific, overwhelming, life-altering grief that only things that genuinely matter can produce. Just Fontaine's 13 goals, 1958, a replacement player, brought into the squad because another player was injured, who scored 13 goals in 6 matches, a record that has stood for nearly 70 years. That will almost certainly stand forever. Because the combination of circumstances required to break it, a player in the form of his life in a tournament where his team plays 6 matches, scoring in every single one, averaging more than 2 per game, is so specific and so demanding that the sport's entire subsequent history has not produced a player capable of replicating it. Fontaine's 13 goals are the World Cup's most purely statistical monument, the number that sits at the top of every list and refuses to be approached, and the story attached to them, the replacement player, the unexpected hero, the man who arrived as an afterthought and left as the tournament's most extraordinary scorer, is the World Cup in miniature. The expected narrative disrupted, the unexpected protagonist elevated, the record produced by a man who shouldn't have been there. England's 1966 final. Did it cross the line? Geoff Hurst's second goal. The shot that struck the underside of the crossbar in extra time of the World Cup final. The ball bouncing down, the Soviet linesman raising his flag. The goal given. England winning the World Cup. The question, did the ball cross the line, has been answered multiple times by multiple analyses using multiple technologies, and has never been definitively resolved to everyone's satisfaction. England supporters say yes, German supporters say no. The footage is ambiguous. The technology is inconclusive. And the debate, which has been conducted in pubs and living rooms and newspaper columns for nearly 60 years, will be conducted for 60 more, because some questions are too useful to answer. Because football, like all the best stories, is improved by the unresolved detail, by the thing that can never be fully confirmed, by the moment, one moment in one final, on which an entire nation's most significant sporting achievement rests. Did it cross the line? It doesn't matter. It will always matter. Banks save, 1970. Gordon Banks. England's goalkeeper, Brazil's Pelé. A cross from the right side of the penalty area. Pelé arriving at the back post. Meeting the ball with his head. Driving it downward, toward the bottom right corner. With a specific downward trajectory that makes saves almost impossible. The ball going away from the goalkeeper, accelerating away, the angle closing. Banks. Moving to his right. Going down. Reaching the ball as it bounced. Scooped it over the bar. With one hand. At full stretch. From below the level of the ball. Pelé, watching the ball go over the bar, put his hands to his head. Said afterward that he had already begun to shout goal. That it was the greatest save he had ever seen. The greatest save in the history of football. The verdict is almost universal. From the man who struck the shot. Banks' save is the World Cup's greatest defensive moment. The proof that the competition produces, alongside all its goals and all its individual attacking brilliance, the other kind of genius. The genius of refusal. Of being in the right place. Of doing the impossible thing. Because you have spent your entire life preparing to do it. Maradona's goal of the century, 1986. It has been described already in this telling. But it belongs here too. Not as a description. As a fact. The greatest goal ever scored at a World Cup. The greatest goal ever scored anywhere. By the assessment of a poll of football people conducted 20 years after it happened. 60 yards, 10 seconds, 5 England players beaten, a run that began in his own half and ended in the England net, with a finish of such composed, clinical, perfectly timed precision that the magnitude of the moment, TZT the World Cup quarter-final, the crowd, the specific geopolitical weight of the occasion, was simply irrelevant. Maradona was past it before it arrived. The goal of the century. No argument from this telling. Baggio's missed penalty, 1994. Not a goal, a miss. The shot over the bar. The head bowed. The ponytail hanging. The specific, terrible permanent image of the World Cup's cruelest moment. A player who had scored 5 goals in the tournament, who had carried Italy to the final, who had been across the competition, the most celebrated individual performance outside of Romario, standing over a penalty that would have taken the match to sudden death, and missing. Baggio's miss is the World Cup's most human moment, because it reminds us that greatness and failure are not opposites, that the same player can produce 5 goals and 1 miss, and be remembered forever, as much for the miss as for the goals. Because that is what the World Cup does. It defines. Not always through triumph. Sometimes through the moment when triumph was possible. And didn't come. Zidane's 2 headers in 1998. The World Cup final. The Stade de France. Zidane, not known as a header of the ball, scoring twice with his head in the first 45 minutes. The same delivery, the same run, the same timing. 2 identical moments. confirming each other. The first was a question: could he do it? Was it real? The second was the answer. Yes, it was real. It was him. In this moment. Doing exactly what the tournament and the country and the occasion required. Zidane's two headers are the World Cup's most complete individual final performance. The biggest stage, the biggest moment, the right player, the maximum delivery. The tournament's promise kept completely. Ronaldo's redemption. 2002. The collapse in Paris in 1998. The injuries. The years of not knowing. The return. The final against Germany. 2 goals. The gap-toothed smile. The haircut. The redemption. Ronaldo's 2002 is the World Cup's greatest comeback story. The proof that the tournament, which takes so much, which demands everything, which produces its worst moments in the worst ways, can also give it back, can give the thing it took, in the most significant possible moment, against the best possible opposition, with the eyes of the world watching. Zidane's headbutt. 2006. The other Zidane moment. The one that is discussed as much as the headers, because it contains in a single act the full complexity of the man. The composure and the fire, the stillness and the violence. The 20 years of professional football and the moment when the professional dissolved and the human emerged. Complete and total and entirely himself. Zidane's headbutt is the World Cup's most complicated moment. Not the greatest, not the worst, the most human. The moment when the greatest player of his generation showed in the most public possible way that he was made of the same things as everyone else. That genius and fragility can exist in the same body. That the composure has limits. That beneath every controlled performance there is a person with feelings and history and the specific, private things that other people say in World Cup finals. Germany 7, Brazil 1, 2014. The Mineirão Stadium in Belo Horizonte, Brazil versus Germany, a World Cup semi-final, hosted by Brazil, who needed this to not happen. The score at halftime was 5-0. By the 70th minute it was 7-0. Brazil pulled one back near the end. Germany scored again, 7-1. The largest margin of victory in a World Cup semi-final in the history of the competition. The largest defeat in Brazilian football history. The specific, terrible, nationally devastating irony of the country that had hosted the Maracanazo in 1950, that had built the wound of that night into its football culture, that had made the World Cup a matter of national identity and redemption, hosting another catastrophe. 64 years later, in a different stadium, with different players, but the same essential horror, the same silence, the crowd weeping in the stands, the players on the pitch unable to process what was happening, the television cameras showing faces, supporters, players, the president of Brazil, everyone, that contained the specific expression of people watching something they cannot believe. The Mineirão, Brazil's second Maracanazo, produced not by a single goal in the final minutes, but by an avalanche, by a comprehensive, relentless, almost mechanical German dismantling of everything Brazil had built toward. In front of Brazil, at home, on the same ground the country had prepared to celebrate. Messi lifting the trophy. 2022. The bisht. The golden robe. The trophy held above his head. The tears. The crowd. The moment that 16 years of trying had been building toward. Messi lifting the World Cup is the tournament's most complete ending, not because it was the most dramatic moment, though it was extraordinarily dramatic, not because it was the most technically brilliant, though the football that produced it was extraordinary, but because it was deserved, in the specific, complete, unmistakable way that sporting achievement occasionally arrives as deserved, because the talent had always been there, and the will had always been there, and the near misses had accumulated in a way that made the eventual arrival feel like something more than fortune, like something owed, by the sport to the player, by the tournament to the man who had given it the most sustained, most complete, most extraordinary relationship between an individual and a competition that football had ever produced. The players. Some players belong to club football. Some players belong to the World Cup. The distinction is not about quality. The greatest club players in the history of the sport are the greatest World Cup players. But the tournament has a specific relationship with certain individuals, a relationship that goes beyond what they produced in any single match or any single tournament, and into the realm of mythology. These are those players. Pelé, the king. 3 World Cups. The youngest World Cup winner in history. The player who made the tournament global, who made football mean something beyond sport to billions of people who had never heard of the Football Association or the Football League or any of the institutional structures that the English inventors of the game had built, who arrived at 17 and wept with joy when it was over, who returned in 1970 with a team around him of such extraordinary quality that the football they played together is still the standard against which the World Cup's highest moments are measured. Pelé is the World Cup's king, not because of any single performance, not because of the relationship between a player and a tournament that produced, across 3 editions and 12 years, the most sustained individual contribution to the competition's mythology that any player has made. Just Fontaine, the record, 13 goals. 1 tournament, never repeated, never approached. Fontaine's place in the World Cup's gallery is the most specific in the room. He is there for one thing, the record. But what a record. What a single, extraordinary, permanent contribution to the tournament's history. 13 goals in 6 matches by a replacement player who should not have been there, who left a mark that has outlasted everything the more celebrated players of his era produced. Because records, unlike performances, don't fade. They stand until they're broken. And Fontaine's record is still standing. Eusebio, the unfulfilled. 9 goals. A player of such explosive, devastating quality, the pace, the shot, the finishing ability, that the tournament he graced is still considered one of the great individual performances in the competition's history. But no World Cup final. No trophy. Portugal's greatest player, until the generation that followed him, left the World Cup with a 3rd-place finish and 9 goals and the specific, familiar ache of a player whose talent was entirely real and whose reward was entirely insufficient. Eusebio in the gallery represents the World Cup's recurring truth, that the greatest players don't always get what they deserve, that the tournament is not a meritocracy, that it distributes its ultimate prize without reference to who is most deserving, and that some of the most gifted players in the history of the sport left it without the trophy that their talent deserved. Eusebio stands next to Zico in this room, and Platini, and Cruyff, and Figo, all of them extraordinary, none of them champions. Maradona, the standard. He has his own chapter. He deserves his place here too. Not for any specific moment, though the moments are extraordinary, for what he represents. the standard against which the World Cup's greatest individual performances are measured. The answer to the question, what does it look like when one player carries a team to the World Cup entirely on the force of their own genius? It looks like 1986. It looks like Maradona, Ronaldo R9, the phenomenon, the collapse and the redemption. 1998 and 2002. The two acts of a story that the World Cup produced across 8 years. The player who had everything, the pace, the skill, the finishing, the physical gifts that made him unlike any centre-forward the sport had produced, and lost it temporarily to circumstances beyond understanding and got it back in the final, with the world watching. Ronaldo R9 is the World Cup's greatest redemption story, the proof that the tournament which gives so much and takes so much can restore what it removes in the most complete possible way. Zidane. The contradiction. The headers and the headbutt. 1998 and 2006. 2 World Cups. 2 defining moments. One of joy and one of violence. Both entirely him. Zidane is the most complicated figure in the World Cup's gallery. Not because of anything unclear about his talent, but because the tournament produced both the best and the most contradictory expressions of what he was. The composure of the headers, the fire of the headbutt. Both real, both Zidane, both essential to the complete picture. Messi, the journey. The long wait, the near misses. The final, the bisht, the trophy. Messi is the World Cup's greatest story. Not its greatest player. That conversation is complex and depends on what you value. Not its most dominant individual. Maradona in a single tournament was more dominant. But its greatest story. Because the arc of it, from the 19-year-old who arrived in 2006 and scored a beautiful goal against Serbia and Montenegro, to the 35-year-old who lifted the trophy in Qatar, is the most complete narrative the tournament has ever produced around a single individual. Beginning, middle, end, joy, heartbreak, redemption, talent that was always there, trophy that finally arrived. The greatest journey in football history, completed. The matches. There are matches that decide tournaments, and there are matches that define the sport. Uruguay versus Brazil, 1950. The Maracanazo match. 200,000 people. The silence. The wound. The match that proved the World Cup was real. West Germany versus Hungary, 1954. The miracle of Bern. The finest team in the world beaten by the team that had lost to them 8-3 in the group stage. The proof that the knockout format, the specific, merciless, no second chances format of the World Cup's decisive rounds, could produce outcomes that the quality of the teams could not predict. Brazil versus Italy, 1982. The match that Brazil needed only a draw to win. That Italy won 3-2. Through Paolo Rossi. The most beautiful team losing to the most clinical. The definitive expression of the gap between playing the best football and winning the tournament. Argentina versus England, 1986. The hand of God. The goal of the century in the same match. 4 minutes apart. The most discussed 40 minutes in the tournament's history. Germany versus Brazil, 2014. 7-1. The Mineirão. The match that produced a word. 7-1. 7-1. A scoreline so improbable in its context. The host nation. The Maracana descendant. The country that had built the World Cup into its national identity. That it produced a specific, collective, permanent shock. Not just to Brazilians, to everyone who watches football. Because 7-1 in a World Cup semi-final between those two teams in Brazil is not just a football result. It is a statement about the gap between expectation and reality, about the World Cup's capacity for producing the unimaginable, about the sport's permanent, irrevocable, entirely democratic refusal to guarantee the outcome that the narrative demands. Argentina versus France, 2022. The greatest World Cup final ever played. By many assessments. Not the most beautiful, but the most complete, the most dramatic, the match that produced the full range of what the World Cup promises. The lead, the collapse, the comeback, the extra time, the penalties, the save, the winning kick, and the image. Messi, the bisht, the trophy. They are all here, in this room. The Maracanazo and Banks' save and Maradona's goal and Baggio's miss and Zidane's headers and Ronaldo's redemption and Mbappe's hat-trick and Messi's trophy. The greatest moments the World Cup has produced. Collected, not ranked. Because ranking them would require choosing between different kinds of greatness. Between the greatness of the goal and the greatness of the save. Between the greatness of the triumph and the greatness of the loss. Between the greatness of Pelé's joy and the greatness of Baggio's grief. They are all here. All part of the same story. All essential to the complete picture. The World Cup. Nearly a century old. Still producing the things it has always produced. Joy and heartbreak and individual genius and collective failure and the specific, unrepeatable, 4-yearly drama of the greatest show on earth. Still capable of surprise. Still indifferent to the narrative everyone assumed it was following. Still the most important thing football does. And still waiting for the next one. For the next player who will arrive at their first World Cup with everything to prove. For the next upset, the next record, the next goal that makes the world stop and stare. The next moment when a goalkeeper makes a save that Pelé says he had already begun to celebrate. The next final decided in the last seconds of the last match by a player nobody expected to score. The next trophy lifted by the player who waited the longest. The next image that travels around the world before the final whistle has stopped echoing in the stadium. The World Cup is coming. As it always comes, every 4 years, without fail, the greatest show on earth. Ready to produce the thing nobody was ready for. Epilogue. Every 4 years, and so we arrive at the end. Not of the story. The story doesn't end. It never has. It never will. Right now. In football academies and national team training camps and the offices of FIFA administrators and the living rooms of children who have just watched their first World Cup and understood, in the way that only children fully understand things, that what they have just seen is the most important thing that has ever happened. The next chapter is being written. The next player is being developed. The next upset is being prepared by the next team that nobody expects. The next moment, the one that will make the world stop, that will be discussed for decades, that will eventually find its place in the gallery alongside the Maracanazo, and the goal of the century and Baggio's miss, and Messi's bisht. Is already somewhere in the world, waiting for its tournament, waiting for its moment. We began this story in 1930, in Montevideo, with Jules Rimet standing on the pitch after Uruguay's victory over Argentina, understanding that what he had created was only beginning, that the small, slightly chaotic 13-nation tournament in a half-built stadium in South America was the foundation of something that would grow beyond anything he could currently imagine. He was right. It grew beyond anything he could imagine. beyond anything anyone could have imagined. 4 billion viewers, 32 nations, 1 trophy, 1 month. Every 4 years, the largest shared human experience that civilization has ever organized. Across the 9 decades between that first final in Montevideo and the last final in Qatar, the World Cup has produced everything. It has produced the Maracanazo, the silence of 200,000 people who came to celebrate and found grief instead. It has produced Pelé at 17, weeping on the pitch in Stockholm with the specific, unguarded joy of a boy who has just done the thing he was born to do. It has produced Just Fontaine's 13 goals, the record nobody expected, produced by the player who shouldn't have been there, that has stood for nearly 70 years. It has produced England's finest hour, Bobby Moore lifting the trophy at Wembley, the image that a nation has carried for 6 decades. It has produced the 1970 Brazil team, the finest football ever played at a World Cup, the standard against which all subsequent beauty is measured. It has produced 1982, the most beautiful tournament, the most devastating elimination. Zico, standing in the Barcelona evening with nothing while the football he played deserved everything. It has produced Maradona, the hand of God, the goal of the century, the man from Villa Fiorito carrying Argentina to the trophy on the force of his own genius. The most complete individual performance in the tournament's history. Unrepeated, possibly unrepeatable. It has produced Gazza's tears and Shalati's goals and Baggio's miss. It has produced Zidane's headers and Ronaldo's collapse and Ronaldinho's smile and the chip against England and the gap-toothed celebration in Yokohama. It has produced Germany's 7-1. It has produced Messi, the long wait, the near misses, the final against France, the bisht, the trophy, the image that the sport had been building toward for 16 years. All of it. Every extraordinary, heartbreaking, joyful, complicated, political, human thing the tournament has produced across nearly a century is part of the same story. The World Cup is not just a football competition. It is a mirror, held up to the world every 4 years, reflecting back the state of things, the political tensions and the cultural shifts and the changing balance of power between nations, and the evolution of the game itself. It held up that mirror to Mussolini's Italy and showed the world something it should have found uncomfortable. It held up that mirror to Argentina in 1978 and showed the world something it largely looked away from. It held up that mirror to Qatar in 2022 and produced a debate about what hosting means, about what money can buy, about what the tournament is willing to overlook in exchange for the spectacle. That has not been resolved, and may never be. The World Cup is not clean. No event involving human beings and nations and politics and money ever is. But it is. Despite everything, despite the corruption and the controversy and the moments when the sport failed to be what it claimed, the most extraordinary thing the game has ever produced. The most ambitious, the most watched, the most emotionally significant, the competition that Jules Rimet dreamed of in a village in eastern France, that he carried to Montevideo, and that has grown across nearly a century of tournaments and billions of viewers, and thousands of matches and hundreds of thousands of goals, into the greatest show on earth. The next World Cup is coming. The next 32 nations. The next group stages and knockout rounds and penalty shootouts and golden goals and moments of individual genius that make the people watching them understand, immediately and completely, that they are witnessing something they will never forget. The next player who arrives at their first tournament as a teenager and leaves it as the most discussed footballer in the world. The next upset, the next record, The next moment when a goalkeeper makes a save that the striker says was already a goal. The next final decided by a player nobody expected to score. The next image that travels around the world instantly, the next trophy lifted, the next nation celebrating, the next set of supporters who have waited 4 years and can now stop waiting. If you are still here, if the story carried you through the night, if the names and the moments and the long, extraordinary history of the greatest competition in sport kept you company as everything else fell quiet, then this was exactly what it was made for. Echoes of the pitch exist for this. For the space between wakefulness and sleep, where the noise of the day fades and football becomes something softer. Not the anxiety of a match result, not the frustration of a table position, not the noise of the transfer window or the press conference or the tactical debate, but history, memory, the long-considered, unhurried story of the sport told slowly enough to actually feel. The World Cup deserved that treatment. It has earned it, across nearly a century of producing the most extraordinary, the most human, the most genuinely significant things that sport has ever produced. So rest now. The World Cup will still be there in the morning. The Maracanazo will still have happened. Pelé will still have wept in Stockholm. Maradona will still have run 60 yards in 10 seconds and beaten 5 players and walked the ball into the net. Zidane will still have headed twice in Paris and walked past the trophy in Berlin. Ronaldo will still have smiled with the haircut. Messi will still have lifted the bisht above his head in Qatar. All of it permanent. All of it there. All of it yours. The greatest show on earth. Good night.